So really excited for this one. Obviously, it coincides nicely with the new Marine National stuff for Victory at Sea, and also generally someone we've wanted to have on for a little while, mostly because I'm a shameless fanboy. I promise I'll try and keep my questions at least slightly relevant to folks in the chat. But yeah, what is not showing on the back. It just says, Marcus, don't talk about Kamchatka for an hour.
Yes.
So, shall we leap straight into it? Hello to everyone in the chat. And if we're ready, Drac, shall we?
Yep, let's go for it.
So, obviously, many people may know who you are and what you do, but for those who don't, could you just give us a little introduction about yourself, kind of who you are, what you do, and how you got into wargaming?
Okay, so I'm known on the internet as Drachinifel, or most people just shorten it to Drac, which is, to be honest, a lot easier. I run the Naval History channel on YouTube of the same name. So these days, I'm mainly a naval historian. Up until a few weeks ago, I was also an engineer, which is actually the day job. Well, was the day job. Technically still is, because I'm now a private consultant for engineering as well, but there you go. Also sometimes sci-fi geek, medieval reenactor, and a few other bits and pieces, some of which are slightly more dangerous than others. I self-taught myself fire breathing and managed not to go to hospital. So there you go. So that's me. These days, yeah, apart from my engineering consultancy, I mostly do the naval history stuff on YouTube. Lots of background research, currently building up a nice big archive of naval photographs, which I'm slowly scanning and uploading for public domain usage, because I don't like history being locked away behind paywalls. And how I got into wargaming, well, that's a long story. It goes back almost as far as when I got interested in naval history. So that would have been 1990 when I was 4 years old, when I went down to Portsmouth and saw HMS Victory. And of course, in my young childish mind, apart from being very impressed, I wanted an HMS Victory at home. My nan, fortunately, was slightly saner than I was and got me a little plastic toy one. But a few years later, I got a plastic model of Victory FX kit. That didn't last very long, as you might expect. But then I was like, oh, but if I can have one, maybe I can have more. And if I can have more, then they can fight their battles again. And shortly thereafter, it was a case of, well, where can I find lots of ship models and put them all together and have them fight battles and it not take up the entire room? And at that point, it was probably 8 or 9. And it turns out, yes, that's called naval wargaming, which I hadn't heard of until that point. And so I started down that route. And of course, as is almost inevitable with, I think, most modeling and wargaming orientated people in their teens in the UK, also paralleled that with Games Workshop. Although I must say, in my defense, I did kind of get very stuck into Battlefleet Gothic first, because that was their naval sci-fi war game on top of my battleships and Age of Sail ships.
I think that's pretty common for. I know it's certainly common for us. It's common for most of our viewers. The evil empire sucks everyone in at some point in their life.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's pretty common. It's kind of good to know that there is that commonality kind of between all of us. That one hook. That's an interesting hook and a really intimidating first kind of thing to set yourself. You know, most people are like, oh, I want to do some planes, which are pretty simple, or a tank. You're like, nope, give me rigging.
Yeah.
Give me rat lines. Give me sails.
Yeah. My grandparents still got a photo somewhere of me that they came into, because I was with them for that weekend. And they came into me, I think I was probably about on my second Age of Sail model, in age about 7, having just been introduced to the wonders of liquid poly,
yes.
And trying to attach rat lines and rigging with liquid poly, which turns out is not such a brilliant idea. But there's just little me looking up at my granddad, who's just taken a photo because he found it so hilarious, and my hands just look like some kind of like Shelob's lair of melted plastic and thread.
Oh, God. Max, very quickly, I'm just seeing the little remaining meeting time thing ticking on Zoom. Yep. Yeah, of course.
Mhm.
So the joys of high-end working with industry types, Drac, is you get to deal with this kind of high-end industry nonsense, by which I mean making sure the Zoom account's attached to the right thing. So
Fair.
going to the next question, obviously we
Mhm.
kind of touched on it a little bit just then. Obviously
Mhm.
you're best known for the naval history stuff. You're best known as a naval guy.
Yeah.
You've kind of touched on it a bit with Battlefield Gothic, but do you play any other kind of air, land, space-based systems at all?
Well, apart from the, say, from the obligatory sort of standard 40k stuff and Adeptus Titanicus, you've got Battlefield Gothic, naval, sci-fi. Most of my interests then tend to be naval sci-fi. I did for a while play Cold War Commander, the really tiny scale stuff. That was basically so that I could carried like 2 armies around in a lunchbox more than anything else.
6 mil or something.
Yeah. But other than that, most of my wargaming has I don't think I've ever done an aerial war game.
Okay.
I've done a few land ones like I mentioned, but almost everything that I've done has been naval or naval themed, so either navies in space, Age of Sail in space, Drop Fleet Commander, that kind of stuff, or dystopian wars, which I probably have the most of at the moment. And of course Cruel Seas, Black Sails, and Victory at Sea. So yeah, it's kind of, if it's naval based, I'm going to be a lot more interested in it, and if it's not strictly naval historical based, then it's either naval sci-fi fantasy setting or in space navies. That's what appeals to me the most. So that's where most of my wargaming lies.
It's got to have that hook for you.
Yes.
There's got to be something that resembles a boat in some capacity.
Yes, pretty much.
It doesn't matter what it's sailing, so long as it's sailing and fighting things, you're a happy man.
Yeah.
Which I think is, I think again, that's quite common. I'm very much a case of, does it have really big tanks in it? And if so, I'm probably happy. But interestingly, I was kind of sat there waiting for a naval game that I could access, that I had mates that would play to come along forever. Because, I used to sit there and go, I could just buy the entire Flotte de Chantillon for really cheap in some tiny scale and push them around the table myself. But I want to play with people. Yeah. And Victory at Sea comes out. I'm like, finally, the company mandates that people play obscure battleship games with me.
Yeah.
So obviously some frantic typing going on behind the scenes, but kind of moving forwards. And, you've mentioned you've played a range of naval games, which I think makes a really good base to answer this question. Looking at naval wargaming, what do you look for most in a system generally? Is it historical accuracy, that granularity? Is it easy to play, competitive? What's the thing that you're really looking for? And what do you play most of as well? What kind of games do you mostly play?
So it's kind of tied. The two are tied together. So if it's going to be if it's not going to be representing a historical thing, so if it's a fantasy or sci-fi or in space, something like that, then obviously there is no historical accuracy.
Yeah.
But if it is going to represent a historical period, then I'm not necessarily going to be kind of, oh yes, well, I want, I don't know, British ships of the line to have a reload rate of exactly 1 round every 30 seconds, and French must have a reload of 1 round every 90 seconds or something. But I do want it to be, there be at least some recognizable and historically accurate element to it.
Yeah, you want it to feel.
Yeah, it's like, so to take that example again, if you're talking about Age of Sail, then Napoleonic era, then I would expect the British to have an advantage in gunnery and maneuverability, but the French to have an advantage in speed, for example.
Yeah.
So, and it could just be something very basic, but as long as those basic general balance points are there, that's fine with me. It's the feel. I'm not usually very particular about absolute 100% historical fidelity, because let's face it, those battles took hours to run with hundreds of people, so you're never going to actually fully replicate that.
No, you've got to game some of it after all.
Yeah.
Otherwise you're just simulating it, and there's some very good simulators for things like that.
Yeah. And with balance, I like a balanced game, but I don't want it to be what I call too balanced, where everything can be interchangeable. There has to be side advantages and disadvantages to different sides in different situations. And to be honest, even as long as it's accurate within the lore, if it's fantasy style, or if it's accurate to historically, I'm not too fussed if a particular faction has a number of disadvantages that make it less competitive, because that just means it's a challenge. As long as the gap isn't so big that you just can't overcome it no matter what you do. As long as there's some kind of tactical element that means that even playing the underdog, you have a chance of victory if you play your cards right, then that's great. And when it comes to the kind of games I therefore play, I'm kind of I'm a man of two extremes. Mm-hmm. I either just like to play very fun pickup, I guess you call them pickup games, but basically games where you can play to the lore or the history rather than a game where you're trying to win at all costs.
Yeah, absolutely.
So and it's just fun because it's like, and now I'm going to charge into close combat because I have decided that I'm going to try and board everybody today, and therefore we shall see what happens. The flip side is that, as you probably know from watching the channel, I do sometimes do multiple playthroughs of highly detailed wargaming in order to try and establish with some of the really granular systems.
The Jutland possibly being the best recent example of that. Yeah,
Jutland, alternative versions of the Battle of Samar, my Battle of the Texel, my alternative What If Jutland, but in 1918. And that's where I play them through, and it will take a few hours to do, but then I'll play them through multiple times to see how the different results pan out. At that point, then I am looking for a lot of historical accuracy, but at that point, I also end up tending to modify the rules quite extensively to represent that historical accuracy. Anyway, so as long as the rule set has effectively a baseline roughly historically accurate damage model, and fire model, then apart from that, I'm quite happy to improvise everything else, because if you're going to go at that far extreme, one of the biggest problems of conventional wargaming is everyone's looking at a table, so you all know what's happening, which historically it was never actually the case. So we have all sorts of fancy systems of like people standing behind curtains and doing double blinds and things like that.
I was actually really inspired by the double blind that you did for the way you described how you've done it for Jutland, I think.
Yeah.
Springsmine and Texel. That I kind of sat there and go, that's really easily applicable to so many things. And I'm kind of sat there going, I want this pandemic to end so I can get in a big room with a bunch of people and try that and see if it works for other games as well. It's certainly you can tell the difference when people genuinely don't actually know everything about what's going on the table. They suddenly become a lot more cagey and tactical about their decision making, which is quite fun. Which is nice.
But the thing I tend to find is it's either one of those two extremes. I have occasionally played with various game systems in various tournaments and stuff. But as I'm sure you've probably found, it can be a little bit hit and miss. Sometimes you'll get a tournament where, although everyone's playing to win, they're very friendly, very happy. Everyone's still backing each other up. And sometimes you just enter a room where everyone's like, no, I want to win. And if you even so much as knock off one of my units one turn before I plan for it, you are now my mortal enemy for ever and always. And I'm going to call the judge in on every single possible thing you ever do. And at which point my temptation is just to sort of roll my eyes and walk away. So I tend to avoid most tournaments for that reason, because although some of them might be really nice, you can't guarantee it.
Yeah.
And to be honest, sometimes win at all cost players get very annoyed when I just Leroy Jenkins my entire army down the middle, and they have no idea what to do because no one would possibly ever do that. That is insanity.
I might actually try that. Given my record against Max in our recent games, I might just start doing that. Turn one, just charge.
Yeah.
This is true. Although, I did beat you in the Victory at Sea playthrough because I had the power of God and the long lance on my side.
Oh dear.
Speed 7 heavy cruisers. But yeah, we're on. Max has just finished some absolute heroics, making sure the technology works. He was just stood in front of me, frantically typing, but it's all sorted now, I think. Max, we're on question 5, if you'd like to pick up.
I'd say something in the region of about 1 to 1200, give or take a little bit. And that is because, well, as you know from the video I did on Jutland, I do have some 1 to 6000 scale. But, oh my goodness! It's like, I think I've taken 5 years off the point at which I go blind trying to paint those things, especially when it comes to the destroyers.
God, yeah.
And once you get much above, I mean, depending on the exact scale, I mean, if you're playing something like Cruel Seas, obviously you can afford to be slightly bigger on the scale because the ships themselves are smaller. But for general naval wargaming, I find once you get much above 1 to 1200, you end up at a scale where you can maybe have 3 or 4 ships, and that's it. A, because the models are so much bigger, they're going to cost a fortune, and B, because physically you can't fit many more on a standard 6x4 board. Whereas at 1 to 1200, there's enough, or thereabouts, there's enough detail that you can make the models look really good, and also have a reasonable number of them on the field, so you can recreate most battles. I mean, okay, maybe recreating something like Jutland, you do need to go down to the 1 to 6000 scale, unless you have like more money than Jeff Bezos. But other than that, it works really well, and that's one of the things that attracted me to Victory at Sea and Black Sails, because they're all in that approximate kind of scale range.
Yeah, that's one of the things I found actually working, because I've never done any really small scale stuff. I've pretty much been a universally 28mm guy. Wanted to get into naval stuff. Again, as I said before, couldn't find anyone to play with. Victory at Sea comes out, I'm like, okay, now I've got the little ships in my hand. I've actually got to paint them, and I was kind of quite daunted at first. But I found, yeah, it's a nice balance of size. So, you know, things like Warspite looks intimidating.
Yeah.
But it's also not taking me 3 days to paint her, because a lot of it is, you know, things like washes and dry brushes.
Yeah, yeah. If I want to paint something to absolute like museum level fidelity, I'll go and get a 1 to 300 scale kit or something. But the chances to actually play a battle when your individual ships are 3 foot long are somewhat limited.
At that point, you need to go to.
Yeah.
I was going to say get a motor in there and go down to your local boating lake.
Well, I have actually got a model of HMS Hermes that's actually longer than I am tall. But wow. The problem is once you've got something of that scale, 1, it weighs an absolute ton, and 2, you kind of start to get a little bit precious about what happens to it.
Yeah, you don't really want people throwing things at it.
No.
Let's say it's a good.
Okay.
Yep. Obviously, and there's a nice follow on there that I actually wanted you to ask, Max, because you're the painty one, and I am the one who paints under sufferance. Which would be question 6. That's it. Okay, no worries. So Max has gone silent. He's entered silent running and has submerged for some time. So obviously, and this is something that I found very daunting initially, is naval wargaming has a reputation, fairly or unfairly, for being very heavy and very hard on getting your colours and your details absolutely perfect. So do you kind of have any tips or tricks from a point of view of a historian and a researcher that you can pass on to our audience for getting stuff right, and what you consider the right level of right is?
Yeah, so I think again it comes down to, for me, it's kind of one of 2 levels. Is are you trying to represent a specific ship in a specific time period to a specific level of accuracy? Yeah. In that case, you are going to have to do an awful lot of research to get it right, which can be a bit daunting, but can also be quite rewarding. Yeah. The flip side to that is that, especially when it comes to to stuff like wargaming, you have to draw a line somewhere and say, this is as far as I'm reasonably going to go.
Absolutely.
Because, I mean, I'm thinking of two main scenarios. So, Battle of Trafalgar. Okay, the British are all painted up in the Nelson checker. Great, fantastic, easy to do. We all know what that looks like. The Franco-Spanish are basically the spare laundry fleet when it comes to painting. Not only, as far as I know by English sources, and I've done a lot of looking into this, as far as English language sources go, we don't actually know what all the Franco-Spanish ships at Trafalgar looked like, because there were a few different standardized paint schemes for the French Navy that came out in 1809, 4 years after Trafalgar. And for the Spanish Navy, it's slightly easier because they did have not necessarily, they didn't have a standard uniform color, but they had guidelines and most ships stuck to them. But for example, at Trafalgar, there's the Santa Ana, and I think it's the San Juan as well, are described as black ships by the British. Whereas Santissima Trinidad, we know it was red and black stripes, but then there's a massive argument as to, like, did it have white highlighting on the stern or not? Was there white lines between the red and black stripes? And that's the biggest ship there. So you'd think someone would have written it down. Well, it turns out like 5 or 6 people did, and they all wrote down something different. So, and then you get this whole debate with the black ships of, was that just the whole undercolor and they hadn't touched up the red, and therefore it just all looked a bit mostly black from a distance, or were they genuinely black painted? Because in the Franco-Spanish fleet, everyone had a certain license to paint as they liked.
Yeah.
So, given that, as far as I've done the research, we don't know, then if you know about 1 or 2 specific ships, then sure, paint those up in those specific color schemes. But other than that, settle on something that is distinctive and somewhat period accurate, and do that.
Yeah.
Because then everyone will know who you've painted. It's somewhat period accurate, and let's face it, at that point, anyone who argues differently is going to be wrong, because they legitimately cannot point to any source that tells them that they're right. Whereas if you go forward to, say, World War II, now there we do know for the most part what everybody was painted up in, except they kept changing it.
That was one thing I found. Yeah, there's all that you kind of look at these records. And suddenly it's like, okay, I want to do 1939, start of the war. Which week in September 1939? Yeah,
and it's like for ships that lasted a reasonable amount of time, like say Rodney or something like that, or they'll have maybe 3 or 4 different camouflage schemes during the course of their career in World War II alone, plus some what I would call standard color schemes, kind of flat type color schemes, but there'll even be 3 or 4 of those as well. So, or Duke of York's another good one, where at some point she's kind of just a standard overall grey. Sometimes it's 2-tone grey, sometimes it's 2-tone grey, but there's a very dark grey patch around the citadel. Other times they've slapped on one of the slightly more psychedelic camo schemes, and at that point, I think you can go one of 2 ways. Either you find individual color schemes that you think, oh, that's really distinctive for that ship. Like Rodney has a really weird kind of blue-green one at one point. And you go with that because you're saying this is this ship very definitively. Or you just pick one of the more standard ones, like the US Navy had this wonderful habit of just painting everything a dark blue in the early part of the war, and literally down to the decks are even dark blue. It's like someone just took out a rattle can, just went, that's it, we're done. Yeah. Yeah. So and if that, I would say for that's where, if you just want to paint a fleet, it's like, go for it. Okay, you might end up in a situation where you're in, I don't know, 1940 Royal Navy grey fighting the Japanese Navy in 1944 dark Curie grey or something. But you're playing a war game. Nobody should care at that point. as long as you haven't done to be honest, I was going to say, as long as you haven't done like, I don't know, the US Navy in Bismarck style Baltic camo, people shouldn't worry too much. But to be perfectly honest, if you did want to paint up the entire US Navy in Bismarck style Baltic camo, we'll go for it. It's going to look very weird and people are going to be very confused. But if you do a half decent job, it's like, well done. But yeah, in terms of tips and tricks to get their fleet spot on, I say, yeah, don't stress about it too much, but decide beforehand what you want to do, and then do the necessary research and then follow that through. The worst thing you can do is get halfway through painting a fleet and then just go, I don't like that. I'm going to strip everything down and change it all, because you will end up wanting to like drive a paintbrush through your eyes.
Yeah, I think that's pretty solid advice, to be honest. And that applies really nicely to all of our ranges that are historical, because I think there is so much variation and so much choice out there so much of the time. You know, my late war Germans for bolt action. What colour should I paint my tanks? Well, and in the end, I picked one colour scheme that I liked and went, right, cool. Every single tank is going to be roughly in that colour scheme, even if maybe it would have been a slightly different scheme for that particular tank. Doesn't matter. They're my tanks. They look like this.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you. So, Max.
That one's actually fairly easy for me. I would, if I could have absolutely anything, I would love the Royal Navy fleet circa 1895 to 1900.
Yes.
Because it is a complete and utter mess. They have kept literally everything that they built since the 1860s that hasn't sunk, caught fire, or been sold to another country. So it's a completely eclectic, mad grouping of ships. Plus, it's the late 19th century, so everyone was designing all sorts of crazy, random stuff anyway. And on top of that, at that point, they're all still painted in the rather fetching Royal Navy peacetime camo, which I really like. So, yeah, I just kind of look at that and go, it would look completely bizarre, but it would also look very cool at the same time. So that would be my go-to choice.
Nice. Just for the chat very quickly. Obviously, Max having a bit of mic issues at the moment. The question that he asked Drac was very simply, if you could have any one fleet from history as a war games collection, which would it be? And I think, yeah, you know, I'm on board there, at least in period, if not region. You know, that kind of era of the pre-dreadnought, and everyone's being very silly with what they think is going to work. Nobody's had to test anything forever, really. And you've got, and everyone's keeping stuff, and you've got some navies that are still, you know, kind of would look out of place 50 years earlier, and some that are kind of metaphorically in the space age. Yeah.
I mean, the thing is that almost everyone's doing it. So it's like the French and the Russians are equally good for mad collections.
Yeah.
It literally comes down to that point. I just like the British paint scheme better.
I say, it's a cool one. I thought you were either going to go for something that's really in your channel's wheelhouse for this, or you were going to go completely left field and you'd be like, give me Peloponnesian War.
That's just like infinite triremes.
There you go. There's your backup. There's your backup channel for the future. Infinite triremes. But no, I think I'd be in a similar boat, metaphorical. Alternatively, I wouldn't mind just Jutland. Give me. As a collection, give me all participants at the Battle of Jutland in a nice big scale that I'd never have to try and carry anywhere. I could just sit and I could give them a room in my house and I could look at them.
Yeah. Hopefully, and get someone else to paint them.
Oh God. That would be one where I kind of sit there and go, well, if I paint one of these a month for the rest of my life, I might still have some friends left alive to play with me by the time I'm finished.
Yes.
So, kind of following on from things we're talking about collections and fleets, you've got. I actually looked at your account earlier today. You've got pretty well everything we've ever made for any of our naval games.
Yeah,
So
pretty much.
you're in a not a unique but a reasonably rarefied company there.
Mm-hmm.
So if looking at all of those ships with a focus on victory at sea, but not necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
what's the one model that we don't make that you really, really wish we did? Or in future, what's the one model you really want to see us do?
Oh, now this one was really difficult because I was looking through the various ranges and going, well, what? Ah, no, that's done, and that's done. And eventually, I came down to a short list.
Okay.
But I think for me, it comes down to one of two things. One of two ships, which would either be the Italian refit World War One battleships, the Cavours and Dorias, or the battle cruiser HMS Renown, because that is just a wonderfully, wonderfully good looking ship.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it would be one of those two for victory at sea. There were a few strong contenders. I thought about maybe a county class heavy cruiser. They're really nice. And for a while I was thinking, why isn't there an Enterprise? Then I realized there's Hornet, which basically is Enterprise.
Yeah.
You just have to shave the nameplate off, so that's fine. But yeah, I think it would come down to either Renown or Conte de Cavour.
Which again is kind of, I thought there's going to be at least one answer that's obscure and left field here. That's going to be something that I'm kind of going, oh yeah, no, they did exist. Or there's going to be an absolute classic like Renown. And yeah, good choices. I mean, the good news is there is plenty more stuff coming for victory at sea. Possibly not as niche as some of that, but Renown I wouldn't be surprised to see come out because, and again, in the scale with victory at sea, we are in a position where we can differentiate between ships of a class as well, so we can fill out some of the existing classes at the same time.
Yeah,
which would be nice, to be honest. And I've kind of sat there with my Warspite going, here's the Warspite, here's the file, right? Let's make some Queen Elizabeths.
Yes.
But that's a pretty solid answer there. And with kind of more specifically the Marine Nationale pre-order that's just gone up, I don't know how much of a chance you've had to look at it.
Yes, I did. I had to look over.
So are there any ships that you're surprised for that one didn't make it in, or are there any that you're surprised that did make it in? And overall, from a gaming and a historian's point of view, what do you reckon to that composition? What's your first thought when you look at it?
So when I initially saw it, I must admit, actually, and regular viewers of the channel like yourself will probably not be too surprised, I saw that you'd included Bairn. And I just went, what kind of suffering are you trying to inflict on your players? But the flip side to that, with the one I was surprised wasn't there, was actually they're relatively different ships, even though they're ostensibly the same class. But Dunkirk and Strasbourg, or one of the two, because they had a major sort of role in the pre-war and early war Marine Nationale. Richelieu obviously not quite complete and takes a while to actually get on the front line, but Dunkirk and Strasbourg initially designed for hunting down the German Panzerschiff Deutschland class, and then subsequently Strasbourg's kind of refitted whilst under construction to try and fight the Scharnhorsts. So if there was any one thing that's missing from the Marine Nationale lineup at the moment, that would be the one thing I'd want to see. But yeah, I mean, other than that, to be perfectly honest, there's not a tremendous... The Marine Nationale is not one of the larger navies of World War II.
Yeah.
So the general composition, I think, is pretty good. You've got the battleship, you've got cruisers. The inclusion of Jeanne d'Arc was actually quite a nice one, I thought. I'd say the only thing I would probably do would maybe be to swap out Bern for Dunkirk or Strasbourg. And then I suppose in the future, as you expand the line, you've got the opportunity to include some of the truly ridiculous French hyper destroyers like the Mogador. Although I don't envy you having to try and game balance them.
That's there's the good thing with victory at sea, to be honest, is we can, if we need to, just say no, this isn't balanced. It's a historical ship. Good luck. Have fun if you can.
Then you could have everyone debating the US Navy wasn't ever quite sure with some of those big destroyers whether they were actually small light cruisers or very large destroyers.
I mean, one of the things that I kind of found when the Victory at Sea rulebook first came across my desk as a proof copy was kind of, we have gone in with the ships a little bit, haven't we? I was expecting, you know, reams and reams of rules, and I kind of read through the rules and go, okay, these make sense. You know, I understand these. What's all this at the back of the book? Just a wodge of ship lists, and I'm like, yeah, this is the best catalogue of ships I've seen since the Iliad. So, yeah, it's nice to be able to have all those things that we can make models for in the future, because we've already got in many cases the rules, and we just need to worry about get the models out, get them looking nice.
Yeah.
Just quickly, obviously, we normally have Max to bounce off as well.
Yes.
Max is just had basically a complete catastrophic technical failure. He has, in fact, spotted torpedo boats, but hopefully won't cause any international incidents in the North Sea. Just so chat, if you start getting thinking about questions, I can see there's a few in there, but any questions you've got for Drac, pop them in the chat. We'll do a scroll back once we're kind of done with the prepared questions. And we'll see what Drac's answers to your terrifying thoughts are. So while we wait for the chat to amass their hordes of where's our video on XYZs, if you could refight any naval engagement in history on the tabletop against the real commanders of that engagement and with the real commanders of that engagement, which would it be and why, and which side would you be on?
When I first read this question, I thought, oh, of course, the immediate answer has to be Jutland. But then I thought, to be honest, well, one, if I had all the historical commanders around, I'd be very, very tempted to try and ram the biggest model I could find down Beatty's throat.
I was about to say, would you lock Seymour in a cupboard? And
but also, to be perfectly honest, it's such a huge engagement that it's one of those things you can look back and go, yes, well, of course, I would have done this, this, and this. And then you start reading a bit through it, and eventually you look up from your sixth book and your 14th set of documents from the National Archives and realize actually any one of those commanders almost had to have been sort of a 160, 180 IQ level genius just to be able to keep track of what on earth was going on in his own fleet, let alone fighting anyone else. So I think if I was going to refight any particular engagement on the tabletop, I would probably want a very granular set of rules. And I think on reflection, I would probably actually want to refight the action of Lofoten. Because it's one of my favorite engagements, a little known action of World War II, but also one of the most epic. And it's during the Norwegian campaign. You've got Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are patrolling off the Norwegian coast, trying to support the invasion efforts, and they run into HMS Renown, which has at that point it did have an escort of destroyers, but it's left them behind because they're in the middle of one of the worst Arctic - North Sea storms of that war. And to give you some idea how bad it is, at various points, the German ships have to cease fire because the waves coming over the bows are so strong that they're actually slamming the cartridge cases from their guns back into the gun turrets through the ejection ports. So and obviously they're having sort of large chunks of brass flying around inside is not good for the gun crews. So they have to cease fire. They're actually getting damaged by the water, despite the fact they're 30,000+ ton battleships. And you have Renown, outnumbered 2-1, just charging headlong into the sea like a complete and utter madman, firing off somehow accurate fire and hitting the Germans several times, which makes the Germans retreat. But it's charging so hard that even for Renown, even though it's a bigger, slightly faster ship, the seas actually rip open, I think it's part of her torpedo bulges, and cause physical hull damage. And that's, to be honest, the main reason the Germans get away is because halfway through the action, Renown's now basically dragging this massive water anchor beside it, which lowers its speed. And even they have to check fire sometimes because too much water is coming over the deck. One of the survivors well, I say survives, everyone survived. Well, both ships survived, but one of the crewmen's accounts from Renown that I read talked about shortly before the actual engagement, when the formation was heading towards the Germans, but before they detached the destroyers. He talks about Renown, and he's on one of the anti-aircraft observation platforms, so relatively high up on the superstructure. And Renown hits the trough in a wave, and he looks around to see what's going on, and all he can see is walls of water either side of him. And he looks to the left, and he realizes he has to look up to see the keel of one of the escorting destroyers that's on the crest of a nearby wave. And at that point, the command staff on board is just looking at going, yeah, basically these destroyers are effectively bath toys in the hands of an angry god. So let's let them drop back so they don't smash themselves to pieces. And that's why you'd end up just Renown and the Scharnhorst facing off against each other. But it's always struck me just reading it, even though there's not a tremendous amount of literature about it. I'm sure you have seen Pirates of the Caribbean 3 with the Maelstrom battle. It's like if there was ever a World War II battle that could basically be animated without any much actual talking and just epic Hans Zimmer music and that kind of CGI, that is that battle. So if I could ever refight one with the commander, it would have to be that, because it's just such a crazy action. Neither side has any real particular desire to be fighting that battle, but once they find they are fighting that battle, they're just like, yeah, well, we might be in the middle of sort of literally a maelstrom of ice and snow, but what the heck, let's start shooting at each other as well. That'll improve the situation.
So is side kind of irrelevant to you there as well? You just kind of want to be involved in it more than... I just want to be there. I mean, I kind of, if anything, I'd kind of want, I mean, I wouldn't survive very long, but I'd kind of want to be at the bow of Renown, because just the idea of this one ship charging headlong into both outnumbered odds and the sea, just like, I don't care, I'm here to do a thing, and I'm doing the thing regardless. It's just that kind of absolute controlled recklessness that appeals to me about it. Absolutely. That is, again, I thought, okay, Jutland's going to be the obvious answer, because you've done the refight of that a few times. Or maybe Trafalgar, for example, or Cape St. Vincent or something. But no, that's a really good one, and very Drac answer as well. just enough crazy. So kind of moving on a little bit. I'm sure you kind of gave us a little bit of a mini tour of some of your shelves at the start of this, and we've seen a worrying number, shall we say, of ships. So which of your many wargaming fleets are you the most proud of, and why?
At the moment, pending my completion of some of my Victory at Sea stuff, in terms of painting, at the moment it's got to actually be my dystopian Kingdom of Britannia fleet.
Okay.
A, because it's absolutely massive, and B, because it's this sort of Victorian sci-fi steampunk war game. I was able to fully embrace the late Victorian peacetime color scheme. So it's the closest I'm going to get to my late 19th century British fleet. So it's just like two full shells of glorious black, white, and gold everywhere, which is just fantastic. Close second, I think, probably has to be my literally every ship that was at the Battle of Trafalgar fleet, which is obviously made up of Black Sails ships.
Wow!
Because I mean, I'm still rigging them. But the painting is done, and when you I've put them out in the two columns and crescent once, just to make sure I had everything and check off, because obviously you've got the ships of renown, so I was making sure they're actually in the right places as well, and it just looks completely and utterly glorious, which is I really like that for two reasons. One, because they're Age of Sail ships painted properly, they look fantastic. And two, because although as you probably appreciate, how many documentaries, etc., have there been about Trafalgar? How many of them have either just used top-down maps awesome, hilariously bad CGI.
Or wonky stock footage shot
Yeah.
from the inside of like the Master and Commander set or something.
Yeah. And so it's like to have the actual fleets there, period accurate, ship accurate.
Yeah.
It's just like, it just makes me look at it and go, someone needs to just make a decent film of this at some point. But in the interim, I'll make my own.
Just making boom, boom noises and swooping low with the phone camera.
Yes. Yeah.
Like a good little Christmas special for the channel.
Hmm.
Done in one-man production of Drax Ideal Battle of Trafalgar movie.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be honest, when I managed to get a hold of the National Museum of the Royal Navy, i.e. Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, I am hoping to do something with them and that fleet. So keep tuned.
And kind of staying on a movie theme, actually, what is Drax? I don't know, maybe top 3 to top 5 definitive naval movies? Not necessarily the best or the most accurate, but what are your absolute be-all and end-all of naval movies?
So Master and Commander is right at the top. It is one of the best naval in terms of accuracy, both accuracy of the sets and portrayal of the period, etc. I mean, it's based on the Jack Aubrey books, so
yeah.
They made a few changes to make it slightly more palatable to the American audience because the Acheron was not, in fact, French in the books. No. But yeah, that's pretty much the top of my list because it combines most of the stuff that you can do with the modern movie making industry with actual accuracy and care and attention to detail.
Yeah.
Sink the Bismarck. Much older film is definitely up there as well. In part because they try and keep it as accurate as they can. Yes, there is some stuff that is very blatantly we stuck a giant Airfix kit in a bathtub, but it's period. You have to accept that. Yeah. But at the same time, it's interspersed with some really nice stuff, like some of the people who are playing the bridge crew on HMS Prince of Wales were actually the bridge crew on HMS Prince of Wales at the Battle of Denmark Strait because it was shot relatively soon after the war.
Yeah.
And the gunnery, the actual loading and firing of the guns was done on HMS Vanguard. So it is legitimately actually a battleship with 15-inch guns loading and firing its guns. So, and I think also it does a good balance. It's not massively triumphalist. That's one of the things I actually hate about some naval movies when they get far too triumphalist. Oh yes, we've won, look at our glorious victory, blah 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 blah. Whereas in Sink the Bismarck they do take the time to show the other side of things.
Yeah.
So Bismarck is not some kind of inhuman monster ship that is there only to be a shell pinata. They actually do show it's not a pleasant thing to be on Bismarck when it's getting shot to pieces, which is an important balance. So those two, Das Boot.
Classic.
Unsurprisingly,
I've got the director's cut and the mini-series cut of the original Das Boot.
Yeah.
Normally kind of once a year, I'll chuck the mini-series cut on and spend a happy afternoon watching a lot of sweaty German men make strange faces at the ceiling.
Yeah.
They're very European school of facial acting.
And again, it's like that like with Sink the Bismarck, it shows that you can have a good historically accurate naval movie without having to take massive swathes of artistic license.
Yeah. You can just make something that's fairly realistic and on the face of it, not boring per se, but for an awful lot of Das Boot, there's no action.
No.
Which is also true of, for the vast majority of every combat sailor's career, is you spend most of it not in action.
Yeah.
Which I like a lot.
Yeah, and I think those will probably be my top 3 picks. There's sort of a rotating list that occasionally will drop into position 4 and 5.
Yeah.
Depending on how I'm feeling that week. But yeah, the new Greyhound one with Tom Hanks is not half bad. It's got a little bit more artistic license than I'd necessarily appreciate.
Yeah.
Some of which is kind of like, okay, that's because it's there for the American audience, fine. But But a lot at the same time, a lot of the stuff that the individual things that are in there, obviously it's not a historical movie because it's not based on a ship that actually existed in history. But a lot of the individual scenes are taken or very heavily inspired by things that actually legitimately happened.
Yeah.
And where there's some stuff that perhaps a naval historian like myself would go, no, that's wrong. Unlike some other movies, I can look at it and go, actually, I can see why they've done it. And so whilst it might be historically incorrect, like the fact they're using a Fletcher class on the North Atlantic convoy runs at all, which is pretty much rare to the point of non-existence because then fleet destroyers, they're not actually that good at convoy escort. Yeah. And also Admiral King wanted them all in the Pacific. So, but the fact is that there are quite a number of Fletcher class destroyers still around. Yeah. And Tom Hanks, obviously being the movie's director as well as the main star, he actually went, and I think it was USS Kidd they went and filmed on. So on the one hand, yes, filming on a Fletcher class destroyer in the North Atlantic is a little bit ahistorical. But on the other hand, it means that most of the scenes they've got on the ship are very, very accurate to the ship they're supposed to be on.
Because
it's not like
ship.
Yeah, it's they're actually filming on a real ship. You don't get much more realistic than that. I mean, there's a few bits and pieces that were added to the ship in the 50s that obviously they're not going to rip out just for the filming. Yeah. But it means as an overall product, it's a lot better and a lot closer to reality than something like Pearl Harbor or heaven forbid. The thing is, Pearl Harbor used to be my go-to as this is how you don't make a naval movie. Mm. Midway has now displaced that. Midway is my icy red, I'm frothing at the mouth with rage movie. And they somehow managed to pull off making Pearl Harbor look decent by comparison, which is never a phrase I thought I would say.
No, I watched some of the. I'm a big aviation nerd. Cold War aviation is my main thing, but Second World War aviation, very cool as well. And I watched like 10 minutes of some compiled like air fighting and some of the dive attacks, and I'm like, what? What? None of this is happening. None of this is real.
No,
this is you've made Star Wars. You've made bad Star Wars in 2 dimensions.
And I mean the thing is with that movie, to be honest, the most irritating thing about it to me is that they clearly had 2 different people working on the details. They had one person who was working on what I call the micro details, the small scale stuff. Yeah, and whoever that person was in charge of things like where the bombs are landing on the Japanese carriers. They did a spot on A-star job, and I would like to meet them and shake their hand. And they had someone else who was doing the macro level work of the CGI models and the general, let's say, air-to-air combat and stuff. And that person clearly was drunk, high, or both. And it's like if I met them, I wouldn't be shaking their hand; I'd be slapping them across the face because there's stuff that's just unnecessarily dumb. Yeah. The one I always like to quote is the Mighty Morphin Power Congo. It's like between scenes, a destroyer turns into a Congo class battle cruiser and back again 3 times.
Something out of the works of CS Goto for 40 it's just a certain age. But so moving kind of on to some from the chat now, because we've had some time to build up. Some of these will probably end up having been frequently asked questions on your channel, so I do apologise. One from Ogdog saying, French, for Second World War mostly, French, are they the only navy that tries to go with the forward quad turrets? Yes. Yeah.
Forward, the British have the Nelsons, which are all forward, but they're forward triples. And there's the King George V's, which have quads, but they're fore and aft. The North Carolinas very nearly had quads fore and aft as well. In fact, they almost had 3 quads, which is what King George V was supposed to have. They cut for weight reasons. But yes, the French are the only ones who A, design, and B, actually get up building 2 quad turret forward ships. And bizarrely enough, given their track record of designing some really, really awful battleships in the 1900s and 1910s, it seems they executed their entire design division and replaced them with new people, because Dunkirk, Strasbourg, Richelieu, and Jean Bart are really good-looking ships, and actually really good ships as well. Period.
See, I mean, I'm one of those guys. I think when it comes to how a ship should look, when you did Hotels Go to War, I was drooling because they are, for my money, some of the most beautiful ships ever made. But then I'm also my favourite ever aeroplane is the CP Cat Jaguar, which looks like a cardboard box with 2 triangles stuck on it.
You know, I think that with the French pre-dreadnoughts, from an aesthetic point of view, they are. I can see why people would like them, but as you know, as an engineer, I'm just looking at them and just going, no.
What have you done and why?
Yes.
And another one from Ogdog, actually, I think I've seen you answer before, or at least I think I remember how viable do you think the massive late Victorian guns, like the 100-tonners and things like that, would have actually been in battle on, say, something like Victoria or Sanspareil?
They would have been devastating if they'd actually hit anything. Because one of the things that people sometimes forget, because they're called battleships, these things are not the size of a World War I dreadnought or a World War II fast battleship. A lot of these battleships from that period are actually sub 10,000 tons. Some of them are in the 10s to mid-teens, but not many. And so they're not very big, because not only are they maybe a third of the displacement of what you might think of as a typical battleship, but because they're also massively heavily armored, you can't do a direct comparison with something like HMS Belfast for size, because these things are carrying like 2 foot of armor. So that weighs an awful lot, which means, they displace a lot, but they're actually physically very small compared to later battleships. So if you have something like a 100-ton gun or a 16.25 inch or 17.7 inch shell or 2 that smashes through one of these things and explodes, that's probably going to be fatal damage, assuming it penetrates, because there's just not that much of the ship. But their rate of fire and their level of accuracy is so low that actually hitting someone is going to be a very interesting exercise. You could probably see it happen if, as everyone thought they were going to do anyway, people going in for the ram, and at kind of 50 yards, you take a point blank shot into the other guy's side and you just pray that you're the one who's got that shot off first. But that's really the only scenario where I can see anything like an acceptable level of hitting. And at that point, you've now got like 10, 15 minutes to reload. So that's probably going to be the one shot you get that battle. So it's a kind of, it's an all or nothing. Yes, it will probably do a 1 or 2 shot kill on ships that it does hit, but the chances of actually getting that hit in the first place, fairly remote.
Yeah, which makes sense, to be honest. Then you kind of think that whole time you're reloading, you're getting absolutely paggered by secondary batteries of pretty much every caliber that we've ever thought of making a firearm in. Yeah,
whilst everyone in these massively ponderous vessels just gently wanders around trying to hit each other with a ram bow.
Yeah, and the Mediterranean suddenly starts to feel a little bit small and crowded.
Yes.
And poor Admiral Tryon desperately waving some kind of flag signal, but no one really knows what it is, and there's been a problem now.
Yeah.
So just a very quick one from Gargoyles. Hi, just one for us. Hi, will there be a Battle of the Atlantic package put together by Warlord? I don't have anything specific, but I agree that'd be a really cool bundle to do. I think we may well do something like that, some theatre bundles at some point. And I'd like to throw that one over to Drac, actually. Drac, what would your ideal kind of theatre bundle or starter set that Warlord could do for Victory at Sea be?
Oh, for Victory at Sea, I was saying for Battle of the Atlantic, that's more a Cruel Seas scale of things. For Victory at Sea, a starter one, because obviously you've got the starter set, which is Pacific War. I think if you're going to do a small starter set, then probably the Norwegian campaign.
Okay.
Because there's most of the home fleet floating around there. You've also got the Battle of Narvik.
Yeah.
You've got the Battle of Oslo Fjord. You've got obviously the action of Lofoten, the sinking of Glorious. So the Kriegsmarine pretty much throws everything and the kitchen sink that they actually physically have into that fight. So you can pick any reasonable balance force that doesn't include Bismarck, which wasn't ready at that point, from the Kriegsmarine list. And similarly, you can take pretty much everything from carriers to battleships to battlecruisers to destroyers from the Royal Navy list.
Yeah.
And you can probably represent any rough period of that action. That would make a good starter set. And hey, it's British versus Germans. That'll go down really well in European theatre. If you, the problem is in the Pacific War, there aren't any real battleship versus battleship confrontations that aren't hilariously one-sided. Maybe in the Pacific War, maybe a Midway pack, something like that. Because Corals, I mean, or maybe Coral Sea.
Because all I was kind of thinking is looking through your one on Guadalcanal.
Yeah.
Detailing all the different night actions. Something like that. Something like that again could be interesting because this rotating cast that seems to cycle in and out.
Yeah, I mean, several of the night actions would be good. I mean, again, the thing is, a lot of those night actions are horrifically unbalanced, which would make it difficult for a starter set. But say First Savo Island would make a very interesting starter set because that is roughly equal numbers of cruisers with a few destroyers thrown in at the smaller scale. The Battle of Santa Cruz would be an interesting one as well because you've got Hornet and Enterprise up against Suikaku and Shokaku. And you've got battleship escorts at Santa Cruz as well. So you've got South Dakota there, for example. So you can include battleships. And the Japanese have several surface action groups. So although you're obviously not including both sides in full, again, there's that opportunity: carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, a relatively balanced force for a starter set.
It gives everyone a nice snapshot that they can then choose to build off if they want to, or use as the basis for a starter fleet. So thank you for that free market research, Jack.
That's no problem.
We expect the invoice imminently. But there's an interesting one here from Nige5555, which is basically, are there any interesting paper ships that would be interesting to add to the game? And I think rather than kind of go all of the paper ships, because that's what I'd like to see in, kind of condense that down to, are there a couple of paper ships that you'd really want to see? Obviously, we did model for the Graf Zeppelin, which is pretty paper, although she did eventually float. Are there any ships you'd really like to see us put in and maybe do a model for, maybe do, a bit more of a focus on, that you think would be important or just cool?
Oh, for World War II, I suppose the thing is, I'm trying to think about across all factions, so it's balanced. For World War II, I think the only one that you could probably do across, not necessarily all, but most factions that would be somewhat balanced would be the big on-paper battleships. So obviously Yamato's already there, but they did have the A150 design, the Super Yamatos with twin 20-inch guns. The Americans have got the Montanas. The British have got the Lion class, although the Lion class is not really on the same playing field as the Super Yamatos and the Montanas for the early designs, although there are some very interesting and slightly weird late war variants to the Lion class that may be somewhere in that vicinity. But to be honest, a solid Lion class would actually be quite nice. So I'd say those unbuilt battleships, the French could get one in with, the French actually got several options because you've got Gascogne, which is basically a Richelieu, except now with one turret forward, one turret aft. And then you've got varying options for the Alsace class, triple 15s, like basically standard 2 forward, 1 aft, triple 15s, one variant that's 4 and aft, 2 quads forward, 1 quad aft, that kind of thing. It's less clear what the Italians would have done. And the Germans, I suppose you could do H39, H40. They're probably the last ones that are actually realistically plausible. H44 is basically just a paper design. It's never going to happen. But I suppose, an H39 or H40 to complement. So, that level of paper ship for World War II would be quite interesting. The only other one, which I think might be a little bit harder, but potentially could be very interesting, would be, because with those ones, we know what they would have looked like, and they would have been built to spec for World War II. So it was a case of finding those design documents and doing something that looks about right. The other one that I think would be very interesting, maybe as a kind of a limited or special thing, would be some of the Washington Treaty ships, because the French don't really have a Washington Treaty ship. They've got the Leons, but they're pre-Washington Treaty, really.
Something like the Lexington, had they been completed as.
Yeah, so you've got Lexington and South Dakota 1920s version for the States, Amagi and Amagi or Akagi, Amagi class battle cruisers and Tosa class battleships for the Japanese, and G3 and N3 battle cruiser battleship for the British. Not necessarily all 6, but I think if I was going to choose between the two, I'd probably say the battle cruisers, because they would be the more useful. It's like if they had been built, their speed and armament would have kept them with modernizations viable in World War II, and probably actually hilariously overpowered, with the possible exception of the Lexington. So whether that would be a case of we're going to introduce the Washington Treaty battle cruisers in their Washington Treaty form, so you have really high speed and really scary firepower, but your AA defenses are practically non-existent, which would probably be easier and actually quite an interesting choice if you wanted to take them. I think I'd actually prefer that to a hypothetical if they had been modernized, because at that point it becomes very much a matter of taste, and it's diverging from reality.
It's guesswork and speculation. And see, what I was going to raise, but a lot of people in the chat have already jumped on it. No love for Habakkuk? Just a solid 48 inches of resin on the table.
But at that point I'd be tempted to say you might as well just send, rather than sell them a ship, sell them a silicon mold and just tell them to pour water into it. And just you just freeze it overnight, put it on the game table. When the lump of ice melts and the rest of your ships float off the board, then the game is over.
No, I'm not saying we're going to steal the idea, but there may be one or two once we're allowed to gather properly again. A few comedy games at Warlord HQ involving ice cube trays.
Yeah.
But no, I think there's plenty of cool stuff that was built as well. I think lots of people kind of, when it was kind of announced we were doing Graf Zeppelin, a lot of people came to us and went, "Oh, you're doing Graf Zeppelin? Are you going to do X, Y, Z?" And we're kind of like, well, to be honest, we'd rather do the ships that existed first. Yeah. Because they're the ones that are real and we can measure and define without having to guess so much about. Yeah. So, obviously, chat any more that you've got, obviously, chuck them through. One kind of from me, actually, which is quite an interesting one, because working in the war games industry, being around toy soldiers and things all day, I actually find I do less hobby than I used to. Just because I'm, trying to balance work and life. With you, obviously, doing, something very similar with you talking about naval warfare pretty much all day, every day, and then wargaming it. What's your kind of balance like for that? Do you try and just set aside big blocks of hobby time, or are you a chip away, one thing a night kind of guy?
It depends what I'm working on. If I'm working on a squadron or a ship or something like that, I will tend to have it out on my little hobby area. And if I'm bored to tears with researching some obscure ship or something like that, I'll just put the books down and go, nope, I'm going up and I'm going to do hobby stuff for a couple of hours, clear my head. And that'll be how I'll get most of the individual stuff done. Whereas if I'm trying to do a really big diorama or I'm trying to batch paint, I don't know, like 16 destroyers or something like that, then I will turn around and go, actually, you know what, I'm going to say today or this afternoon or whatever is going to be, this is just for me to do hobbying, and I'll set aside a big chunk of time to do that, especially when it comes to priming and painting. You have to set aside a fairly big block of time, and to be honest, actually it's also somewhat weather dependent. I mean, I've got a conservatory I can do the spray painting in, and no one complains about the fumes because I can open the windows. But simultaneously, that means the weather's actually got to be warm enough that the paint doesn't just instantly kill itself on the way out of a can.
Yeah, it's one of those, the joys of living in the UK. Like, I don't know what it's like where you are, but tonight in Nottingham, it's absolutely beautiful. And a very, very pleasant pubmas eve. But this would be an absolute perfect night spraying on if I didn't have other plans.
Yes.
Like talking to you.
Well, funnily enough, this morning I woke up and everything was covered in snow.
That's a very interesting thing. Like, kind of the rest of the UK seems to be reporting there's snow everywhere, and I'm kind of suddenly going, is there?
But then by lunchtime it was dry and sunny, and by about 2 p.m, when I did a run to the local recycling centre, I had this on, this hoodie on, and I was boiling because it had gone up to about 20 degrees. I was like, well, only in Britain.
I think we have now cemented this as the most British stream ever.
Yes.
We've gone from talking about the might of the Royal Navy to the weather.
Yes.
Max, I got a question.
Oh, Max has a question.
Though. So you might need to repeat this. How long would you spend on a medium ship? Call it a cruiser. How many hours? Because I was working on mine last night. I was kind of impressed by how fast they actually go through and get finished.
Did you hear that all okay?
Yes. Yep. So if we're talking about something on the scale of Victory at Sea, or like say a third rate, or something like that, they're the kind of things I will tend to do in not necessarily in a batch, but maybe in 2 or 3, 4 ships at a time. So what was the last thing I painted? The last thing I painted for Victory at Sea that was that size, I think, was probably the cruisers you get in the Royal Navy starter pack.
Yeah.
So I don't. I'm just thinking. Do I tend to? Yeah, I should paint those through to completion, but it will tend to take a little bit of time, because what I'll do is obviously prime it.
Yeah.
But once I've got them primed, I'll have them in front of me, and I'll choose a color, whatever color, the deck coloring or whatever, some highlighting, or the gun barrels or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'll go and I'll do that, but I'll do it for all the ships that are that need doing at that scale in that color. And then I'll leave that while it's drying, watch something on the TV or something for 15 minutes, half an hour, come back, do the next bit, and so on and so forth, and then finish it off with a wash or whatever. So I think if doing it in that batch format, it's probably an evening, like 3-4 hours but I'll end up with 3 or 4 cruises done by that point. Yeah. I think if I was doing one ship and I was using paints that dried relatively swiftly, I think I'd probably be able to turn a cruiser around from primed to sort of tabletop standard ready in about an hour and a half.
Okay, that's not bad at all.
So, kind of follow-up question off that. Do you tend to put more effort into, like, the title ships? You know, the characters, the big leaders, if it was a 28mm scale? Because I always find my leaders look better than my rank and file, or do you end up with a pretty uniform fleet from the destroyers all the way up to the battleships?
It's usually fairly uniform. The additional detail and fine work tends to come from the fact that the ship has that detail. So what I'll tend to do is and this works across all the naval wargaming ranges, I'll identify a feature or a type of feature that I'm going to highlight or put some edge highlighting on or whatever in a particular color.
Yeah.
And I'll go through, and that will be consistent across the fleet. So it might be hatches, it might be portholes, it might be gun barrels or superstructures. And so how good each ship looks quite often depends on the number and layout of those features on that ship. So sometimes you can get a lead ship, a line ship, a big battleship or dreadnought, and just because it's bigger and has also so many more details, it will look really good. But equally, sometimes you can end up with, especially not so much in the historical ones, but especially in the fantasy ones, you can end up with some of the big stuff that they've made it bigger and more complex, but not necessarily in a good way if you're being consistent about what features you're coloring, and it can look like a bit of a mess. And in those circumstances, sometimes you can end up with a destroyer, which just through some fairly simple, clean and elegant design looks a lot better.
Yeah.
It will depend quite a bit, I think. But yeah, in the historical side of things, I'd say it's generally more uniform, unless it's a ship that I have a particular attachment to. So I think there's like, for my HMS Warspite, that's going to be like revision 4 of where I've looked at it and gone, yes, but if I just add this.
Yeah, it can always be a little bit more perfect for your favourites.
Yeah. Warspite's the one where I'm like, okay, now where's my rust powder? I need the rust streaks from the anchors. Whereas if you tried to persuade me to do that on the tribal flotilla, I just no.
So, kind of following on from that painting-related question, obviously, again, we've kind of touched on it briefly in one of the prepared questions about getting the colours exactly right. And there's so many companies out there that claim to do perfect colours. There's all sorts of guides that go, for this colour, simply use this, blended with this, blended with the hair of a small child and angel's tears. What's your go-to for paints in general? Which companies are you going for? What are you after? Are you loyal to one, or are you whichever works from anything?
It depends what I'm painting, because I find different paint companies do different paints better than others. So if I'm undercoating a World War I, World War II era fleet, I usually just get Tamiya spray cans, the little dinky ones, because some people might argue their shade of Royal Navy light grey is not the precise shade, but it's close enough, and so if someone very purist was to look at it and they'd say, oh, that's maybe like 2 shades too light, but if I put that next to something that's been spray painted in the Japanese dark Curie grey, you can tell the difference and you get the idea of what it is. If I'm doing more general undercoating, or if I'm sort of priming for something that's just my color scheme, but your basic color schemes like you might find with Black Sails, where it's all a bit more primary. For that kind of stuff, I might go with Army Painter sprays. Then when it comes down to the actual fine detail, when you get out the brushes and everything, it's a mixture for me, again, of a mixture of Tamiya and Citadel for the most part. I have a few Green Stuff World paints as well. A lot of my color shifts and metallics tend to come from there. And the other thing which I've discovered in the past probably 2-3 years is the wonderful world of paint pens. Not for the entire ship, because 1, that's just annoying, 2, that takes forever to dry, and 3, there's a limited number of colors and they tend to generally come out quite thick. But there's a range of sort of brush tip pens as opposed to bullet headed ones in metallic colors, and those I do find very useful for very, very tiny highlights and details. So if something needs to be like a gunmetal gray, they'll actually do a better job than trying to paint a gunmetal gray by hand. And again, when you're getting more into the fantasy stuff where you want like a green glow or a metallic blue or something like that, a metallic paint pen that's of the right shade will get you the right consistency all the time. But I will tend, with those stuff, because obviously it's very uniform at that point, I will tend to overlay that with a wash or something like that.
No, absolutely. I'd say that I think they're underrated. You start to see them more and more, but I think for a little while they were kind of sniffed at almost in some of the painting communities. Oh, well, it's not a brush, and you're not crying and sweating blood over it. It doesn't have to be super complicated. Does it work?
Yeah, and as you can probably tell from the complete range of manufacturers, and it's just like, I found this paint, it works really well. So I like Tamiya Dark Iron for some reason, because it looks really good, and the rubber black as well. But if I wanted to do a red, I'd probably use like Blood Angels red from Citadel or whatever.
I'd say it's exactly as you said. It's kind of different companies really have certain kinds of paints that are really in their wheelhouse, and some that they're not so amazing at, and some that they really are. So, chat, we are coming up to the last sort of 10 minutes of the stream. Normally, this would be Amnesty Hour, where chat asks me and Max all sorts of random questions, but mercifully, we do not have to pretend to be the interesting ones in the room today. So obviously there's a couple of questions knocking around in the chat that we'll get to as well. But these will be the last couple, I think. So, Ogdog, again, one you've probably answered in a video at some point, but do you believe carriers would have been such a game changer as they were if they'd been developed more seriously and more thoroughly earlier on?
Possibly, but it is very difficult. It is very difficult to actually say one way or the other, mainly because there's a very big misconception that I think a lot of people have, because they look at Pearl Harbor, the sinking of Force Z, and the fact the Pacific War then goes full on into Coral Sea and Midway, and they assume that, well, the carrier was just waiting for the war to show that it could do its thing. They ignore the fact that there's been an ongoing carrier versus land-based aircraft war in the Mediterranean and the North Sea for about 2 years at that point. And also the technology of naval aircraft and their capabilities has advanced massively in the late 30s and early 40s, and it continues to advance through the war. And so if they'd had more carriers, it would have been useful. But a carrier is only as good as its aircraft.
Yeah, absolutely.
And swarms of hilariously obsolete and rather pathetic aircraft in 1939 wouldn't have had anything as major an effect as a lot of people would necessarily think. I mean, okay, the Swordfish just has a special thing. For some reason, it just keeps going.
It's meaningful payload more than how good is the plane. It's can it get to where it needs to be and do the job, I suppose. Yeah,
but I mean, people look at like the Zero and the Wildcat, and obviously subsequently the Hellcat, the Dauntless and the Avenger and the Kate and the Val. And I always like to point out to them was, wind that timeline back to 1939, and none of them are there. I think the B-5N, the Japanese torpedo bomber, is just coming into service. Everything else in both the Japanese and US air fleets is biplanes. Or maybe the A5M monoplane fighter with fixed landing gear. And the only kind of retractable landing gear metal monoplane that anyone has at that point is the Devastator. And not necessarily the world's best advertisement for modern aircraft technology. And obviously at that point the Royal Navy's got the Skewer, the Rock, the Swordfish is there obviously as well. So if someone turned around and said, oh yes, well, we've got loads more carriers and we're going to go after, I don't know, the Japanese Midway, and we've got 80 Devastators. It's like, well, I hope you like writing letters home to their people's families, because that's what you're going to be doing a lot of for the next few weeks. Mike, they're pointing out the US had the Buffalo pre-Pearl Harbor, but they didn't have it in 1939. The Buffalo's coming. It's one of these things again that is coming into service and very, very quickly recycled back out again in favor of the Wildcat. But I think the thing that probably would have actually made carriers more of a game changer, rather than trying to develop more of them, would probably have been the London naval treaties that actually restricted them past what they restricted at Washington. Because when you look at the early, obviously you got the carrier conversions, Cargo, Cargi, Furious, Courageous, Lexington, Saratoga. But if you look at some of the stuff that was being developed in the early 1930s, and then because of the subsequent naval treaties, they toned it down. So Yorktowns are actually quite small. You have Ark Royal, which is really big and capable, but then because of the displacement restrictions, they tone it down to the armored carriers of the Illustrious class. And there's other reasons for they do all these things as well, but part of it is naval weight restrictions from the treaties. If that element of downsizing hadn't happened, that probably would have been the biggest game changer for the carriers, because if you'd had, say, an Illustrious class armored flight deck carrier, but big enough that it has the flight group of an Ark Royal, that would have been a massive game changer. if the Americans had been able to build the 27,000-ton Yorktowns, or even the 25,000-ton Yorktowns that they wanted instead of the 18 to 19,000-ton, you might not have lost Yorktown and Hornet. And you can kind of see where that could have gone with the Japanese, who kind of skipped out on the whole naval treaty thing in the mid-30s.
Yeah.
And although they built Hiryu and Soryu, which are a little bit smaller, by the time they're going into the war, they've got Zuikaku and Shokaku, which arguably are the best carriers in the world going into World War II. They're not really going to be matched or exceeded until the Essexes start hitting the water, but they show what you can do with 1930s carrier tech. And if as I say, that kind of thing would have been a lot bigger and a lot better. And that's where you probably would have seen a lot of the changes, because Pearl Harbor, the Japanese, as I say, skipped out on the carrier, so that's on the treaty restriction, so that's not probably going to change all that much. But if you imagine Coral Sea, if Yorktown is even bigger and better protected, not quite as damaged, has more aircraft, Midway, Midway went very well for the Americans. They still did lose Yorktown, but if they have even more aircraft, they can maybe hit all the Japanese carriers instead of leaving one. In the Mediterranean, if you've got an armored Ark Royal, effectively, then instead of sending up 3s and 4s or Taranto with less than 24 aircraft, you might have Taranto with 40 or 50 aircraft. That might knock out the Italian fleet. We might even not have the endless controversy of exactly how did Bismarck sink, because if you've got Victorious launching airstrikes, and then obviously Ark Royals there as well, but if you've got all the British carriers with those sort of 65 strong air groups, Bismarck may never make it to meet up with King George V and Rodney. They might just keep hitting it with torpedoes until it rolls over. I think it's not so much the develop them more seriously earlier, it's continue the development scale of size upwards rather than restricting it.
That's a pretty solid answer, pretty Drac answer, which we love, which is kind of one of the reasons we asked you to come on, because obviously we can talk about the wargaming, and then we can kind of pick your brains as well for the historical information that I think is really nice to get in depth with wargaming, and wargaming is a nice gateway to getting to learn more about what you're wargaming, because I think you want to understand it better. So we are coming up to the end of the stream now. Obviously, thank you very much, Drac, for coming on. And I do apologise for obviously the tech issues we've had that have rendered Max mostly silent. Turns out all it takes is a complete microphone failure to shut him up. But obviously, just before we disappear, Drac, you probably get asked this one all the time, but your most favoritist, bestest ship ever?
Warspite, without a doubt. Enterprise is right up there, very close, but the fighting spirit of Warspite and the fact it fought through 2 world wars, and despite being hit by what was effectively the predecessor of modern guided munitions, despite being a World War I battleship, it refuses to die.
There we go. That's short, sweet, to the point, and with feeling. So thank you very much, everyone. We shall see you all again same time next week, so 6 p.m. GMT. And again, thank you very much to Drac for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure, sir.
Thank you very much.
Do you want to let them know what we're doing next week, Marcus?
Which one are we doing next week, Max?
We've got another guest on, haven't we?
We do have another guest on.
Very quickly.
Just very quickly before we let Drac go, because we're sure Drac will definitely be tuning in next week, because he's clearly got nothing better to do on Monday nights than watch us. No, next week we have Alessio. Obviously many war games fame, and he will be coming on basically to discuss
bolt action think tank.
Yes, discuss basically bolt action with what Max has very cunningly coined the bolt action think tank, and we're just going to be taking a look at how rules writing works, throw some ideas around, and see what the situation is. So that'll be a fun one, and for everyone else, thank you very much. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for coming on, Greg.
See you.